Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Sarm Heslop's name has echoed for more than 4 years now, tied to one of the most confounding missing person cases under U.S. jurisdiction. She was a 41-year-old British woman, adventurous but careful, who had relocated to the Virgin Islands for a new chapter of life. On the night of March 7, 2021, she dined and drank with her boyfriend, American yachtsman Ryan Bain. By the next morning, she was gone. There were no witnesses, no splash heard in the water, and no trace found in the cove off St. John. What should have been a paradise retreat became a file in a U.S. crime investigation still unresolved as of today, August 27, 2025. Investigators always say the first hours matter most. In this case, those hours slipped away almost immediately. At 2:30 in the morning on March 8th, a call was placed to 911. Bain told the Virgin Islands Police Department his girlfriend was missing from his catamaran siren song. Dispatchers advised him to contact the U.S. and Coast Guard, since a potential overboard incident fell under maritime jurisdiction. Yet that second call did not come until nearly noon, a delay of 9 hours that would shape everything that followed. When officers first responded to the shoreline, they noted a striking absence. No forced entry to the dinghy that had ferried them earlier, no signs of struggle on deck, just a boat floating quietly in the bay, anchored where it should be. Absence can be louder than presence in crime cases, and here the silence was deafening. Later that day, U.S. Coast Guard personnel boarded Siren Song for a safety check. They issued citations for onboard equipment violations and recorded Bain's refusal to allow a full interior search without a warrant. That decision was within his rights but left investigators at a standstill. In their initial reports, they logged 3 personal effects left behind: Sarm's passport, her wallet, and her mobile phone. Each of those items would normally travel with a person going ashore. The fact they remained on board suggested she hadn't left voluntarily. But beyond that, no physical proof confirmed she had re-entered the yacht after leaving the cruise bay bar hours earlier. This procedural gap became the first anomaly. Detectives recorded the sequence carefully, but with nothing conclusive in hand, the response pivoted to search operations at sea. Divers entered the water. Sonar equipment scanned the bay. K-9 units swept the shoreline. All came up empty. The Virgin Islands Police Department noted the loss of time between the first 911 call and the Coast Guard's involvement. Within investigations, 9 hours can mean a tide shift, a current change, or simply the vanishing of surface clues. By the time searches began, the area was no longer static. The water had moved, boats had come and gone. In missing person cases tied to maritime settings, that can erase fragile evidence. Sarm's family in the United Kingdom would later emphasize this delay as their deepest frustration. They believed her chances of being found alive had narrowed irreversibly before the search ever began. What makes this case gripping and deeply troubling is how little was locked down at the start. Without a verified last sighting on the yacht and with interior access blocked, investigators lacked the foundation they would normally build on: a clear crime scene. Instead, they faced what's called a negative scene, one defined more by what is missing than what is present. Every decision that morning has since been scrutinized: the phone call, the instructions given, the choice not to search the cabin, and the hours lost. Each remains a documented fact in official reports. Each leaves the case balanced on a narrow edge between procedural correctness and investigative handicap. For viewers, one question hovers. In those early hours, was this a tragic accident delayed by bureaucracy or the first signs of a crime concealed by circumstance? At the close of day one, that question had no answer. What investigators did know was simple: a woman was missing, a yacht was anchored, and the trail was already fading. The handoff from land to sea is where this case began to feel unusual. After the delayed call to the Coast Guard, Siren Song, the catamaran where Sarm Heslop had last been seen, became the only physical environment investigators could examine. Unlike a homicide inside a home or a public space with cameras, this was a closed maritime setting, privately owned and legally shielded. It immediately limited what could be documented. When Coast Guard officers arrived by patrol craft, they followed procedure: board, identify the master of the vessel, inspect for safety compliance, and record any anomalies. The vessel was anchored off Frank Bay, a common overnight mooring spot. The boarding log reflects citations for expired fire extinguishers and failure to maintain working navigation lights, safety infractions, not crimes, but the larger issue was access. Ryan Bain, the vessel's owner, allowed officers on deck but declined consent for a full cabin search. Without a warrant, investigators had no lawful basis to force their way below. The report from that inspection listed what was observed in plain view. On the navigation table, Heslop's passport. In a storage cubby, her wallet with identification cards. Nearby, her cell phone, powered off. Those three items established a clear forensic point. She had not taken essentials if she had chosen to leave. At the same time, nothing in open sight suggested a violent struggle. No overturned gear, no broken fixtures. In forensic terms, it was a quiet scene, lacking the normal disarray that often points to foul play. That absence was noted just as carefully as a presence would have been. From a procedural standpoint, investigators now faced a gap. If the yacht could not be treated as a traditional crime scene, then what could be preserved? Officers documented chain of custody for the citations issued, but no physical evidence from inside was collected. That decision remains controversial. Critics argue that the denial of a cabin search closed off the best chance at establishing whether Heslop ever returned aboard after leaving Cruz Bay with Bain. Supporters point out that under U.S. law, refusing consent does not imply guilt, and constitutional protections extend to vessels just as to homes. The practical consequence was that no fingerprints were lifted, no luminol tests applied, and no swabs collected. In true crime investigations, those omissions become permanent. What is not collected cannot later be analyzed. In a missing person file, those early missed steps can define the entire trajectory of a case. Investigators shifted to what they could do. The Coast Guard skiff circled the vessel, photographing hull lines and noting water conditions. They marked coordinates, logged tidal drift, and documented anchor chain length. The intent was to establish whether currents at that location could carry a person out to sea within minutes. But without confirmed entry into the water, those calculations remain theoretical. At the same time, Virgin Islands police personnel attempted to establish timeline corroboration. They wanted to know when Heslop was last verifiably seen aboard. Bain told them she had returned with him after leaving a restaurant the night before and that they had gone to sleep. He claimed to have woken up in the early morning hours and discovered she was gone. Those statements were written into the initial report as preliminary, pending verification. Negative evidence again loomed. No one on nearby vessels reported hearing a splash, shouting, or alarms. In a bay where sound carries at night, that absence became one more anomaly in the file. The forensic angle of this chapter is clear. Without entry to the interior, the yacht was treated more like a stage backdrop than a true evidence container. The official record consists largely of what was not found and what could not be seized. This is the reality of maritime jurisdiction. A crime potentially at sea, but the closest possible crime scene legally sealed. For the family in the UK, this detail became one of the most painful revelations. They could not understand why a yacht linked to a disappearance was not fully examined. For law enforcement professionals, the answer is procedural: rights, warrants, and jurisdictional limits. For families of the missing, that explanation rarely satisfies. At this point in the case file, investigators had a vessel anchored, a partner's statement, 3 critical personal items left behind, and no evidence of forced entry or violence visible to boarding officers. That combination placed the case in an investigative limbo, a missing person scenario with no confirmed crime scene. When a vessel is both the last known location and the only possible container of evidence, what should the threshold be for access? In cases like this, should maritime privacy override the urgent need to preserve potential crime evidence? From the moment the Coast Guard logged their boarding of Siren Song, the case shifted from a static vessel to the moving waters around St. John. If Heslop had gone overboard, the ocean was now the primary scene. In missing person investigations, this stage is often decisive. Either evidence surfaces quickly, or the window of recovery closes. The Coast Guard deployed divers first. These were trained maritime responders, accustomed to rapid searches in confined areas. They entered the water near the coordinates marked in the inspection log, using a circular search pattern from the anchor point outward. Tidal flow was moderate, wind light, and visibility reduced by sediment. Each pass was documented: depth, duration, distance. No personal items, no clothing fragments, no remains were located. Surface vessels expanded the radius. Patrol boats cut slow arcs, while crew on deck scanned for floating material. Within minutes of search onset, they marked the area with GPS buoys to record drift calculations. Their reports noted wave height under 1 meter, meaning any object or body should have been visible at close range. But again, nothing surfaced. Next came sonar sweeps. A side scan unit was towed along the bay floor, producing imaging logs of shapes and shadows beneath. Analysts later reviewed the data frame by frame. Logs show several false positives: coral outcrops, discarded fishing gear, anchor chains. Each anomaly required divers to confirm, but none produced relevant findings. K9 units were deployed on shoreline tracks. These dogs are trained to detect human scent even along rocky coastal paths. Handlers led them from Frank Bay toward Cruz Bay, attempting to trace whether Heslop had come ashore unnoticed. Reports note no positive indications. The lack of scent trail became another negative entry in the file. All of this was recorded meticulously. Each search effort included timestamps, personnel identifiers, and environmental conditions. In forensic documentation, even the absence of findings holds weight. It narrows probability. It establishes that investigators did look, did record, and did not detect. Meanwhile, local police coordinated with civilian volunteers. Flyers were distributed, shoreline foot patrols conducted, and neighboring vessels questioned. Boaters anchored nearby reported hearing no splash, no call for help. Their silence mirrored the absence at sea. These combined efforts produced a procedural wall. Every available search method had been applied, and none had located Heslop. Within 2 days, the Coast Guard concluded its active marine search. The file recorded no person in water located. For investigators, this meant the case could not be classified as an accidental drowning without physical confirmation. For Heslop's family, it meant hope remained, but so did doubt. The emotional weight of this stage cannot be ignored. Friends and relatives in the UK were informed that divers, sonar, and shoreline teams had all come up empty. They understood what that suggested. Either Heslop never entered the water, or she entered under circumstances that left no trace. For families, that ambiguity is devastating. For investigators, it becomes a permanent feature of the case. Here lies the procedural challenge. In homicide investigations, lack of a body can still lead to indictment if other evidence supports it. In missing person cases tied to the sea, lack of a body often halts momentum. Without confirmation, every theory remains speculative. One more technical layer deserves mention: current analysis. Oceanographers from the Coast Guard reviewed tide charts from March 8, 2021. They noted currents moving westward at half a knot during early morning hours. A body in that water could have been carried toward open sea within hours. That finding is preserved in the file, but without entry evidence, it remains theoretical. By the end of the maritime search phase, investigators were left with a paradox. They had scoured the bay comprehensively, and the result was not inconclusive. It was negative. Nothing. In the language of casework, that is a confirmed negative finding. No evidence of person in water, no debris, no trajectory indicators. At this juncture, the Virgin Islands Police Department faced a shift. With the sea producing no answers, attention needed to move inward, to what digital traces might exist, what communications, what financial records. In modern investigations, when physical evidence stops, data becomes the next frontier. When physical searches produced little, investigators turn to the invisible trail most people leave behind: digital communications and financial activity. In modern investigations, those traces often determine whether a person chose to vanish or was silenced against their will. For Sarm Heslop, the trail stopped abruptly. Telecom subpoenas showed her phone activity ceased late on March 7, 2021. Friends in the UK confirmed her last WhatsApp exchange occurred while she was still aboard the yacht. After that, there were no calls, no messages, no location updates. The silence was not explained by poor coverage. Cell towers on St. John and nearby Tortola would normally log any roaming signal. Instead, her device simply went dark. Her financial records told the same story. UK banks reported no withdrawals, no card transactions, and no transfers after that evening. There were no flight bookings, no hotel check-ins, no ATM logs anywhere in the Caribbean. For a woman described as meticulous about work commitments and regular contact with loved ones, the lack of movement was a red flag. Investigators labeled it preliminary but critical evidence. The data did not reflect a voluntary disappearance. Attention shifted to the yacht itself. Navigation logs showed the vessel remained anchored off St. John throughout the night in question. No engine start, no departure track. If SARM had left the yacht, it was within that fixed anchorage. Onboard Wi-Fi logs and device checks added little. The pattern suggested inactivity rather than escape. Analysts highlighted the unusual neatness of the record. In many accidents, stray pings or incidental transactions persist. An automatic app sync, a missed call, a declined payment. Here there was nothing. To some, that absence itself suggested human intervention. A phone switched off or destroyed at sea can erase an entire timeline, and once submerged, recovery of data is nearly impossible. For her family, the silence deepened their conviction. They emphasized that SARM was not impulsive. She kept friends updated, she managed her money carefully, and she was making concrete plans to continue her life in the Virgin Islands. To them, the missing digital traces were not consistent with her character. Investigators documented the limitations of cross-border inquiries. Requests to UK and US phone providers took time, and by the point partial data arrived, some metadata was no longer recoverable. That delay, while procedural, weakened the ability to reconstruct her final hours with precision. Even so, the convergence of evidence was clear. Communications ended on March 7th, financial life ceased, and no trace emerged after. The weight of that silence became its own form of evidence. In a digital age where nearly every action leaves a record, the absence of a footprint can be as telling as the presence of one. For SARM Heslop, the vanishing trail suggested not escape, but erasure. And as the digital analysis reached its limits, investigators turned to the next angle. Who SARM was, the life she lived, and the escalating tensions that might have placed her in danger. In every major disappearance, investigators eventually reached the same junction, understanding the victim not just as a name in a file, but as a human being with habits, relationships, strengths, and vulnerabilities. The answers to what happened often begin with who the missing person was. For SARM Heslop, that step became essential. She was born in Southampton, England, and had trained as a flight attendant before moving into hospitality. Friends consistently described her as reliable, independent, and deeply connected to her circle in the UK. She had traveled widely, often working seasonal jobs, and in early 2020 she relocated to the US Virgin Islands. According to those who knew her, she was drawn to the Caribbean for its warm climate and opportunities in the charter yacht industry. That move placed her squarely into a tight expatriate community on St. John. Her decision to stay on the island was not impulsive. Witnesses reported that she had begun forming stable plans, steady work, a social network, and a relationship with Ryan Bain, an American yacht captain. The two were often seen together around Cruz Bay. On the surface, it looked like a couple building a life. Beneath that surface, however, friends later told investigators there were moments of tension, arguments that spilled into the public, and subtle patterns that now raised alarms. Victimology also includes mapping a person's risk level at the time of disappearance. SARM was 41, physically healthy, and socially engaged. She was not transient. She had ongoing employment prospects, and she remained in daily contact with friends and family. She did not fit the profile of someone likely to vanish without trace or preparation. Law enforcement in both the Virgin Islands and the UK classified her as high-risk missing, a designation usually reserved for cases where foul play cannot be ruled out early. The escalation came not from new forensic evidence, but from the absence of logical explanations. Search teams scoured the Anchorage waters with divers and aerial units. Coast Guard patrols ran sonar sweeps for days. Nothing surfaced. No clothing, no remains, no personal belongings. Every negative result increased the likelihood that the disappearance was not accidental. Statistically, even in open water environments, most victims are recovered within hours or days. Weeks passed with no trace. As investigators constructed the escalation timeline, they noted how quickly media attention grew. British outlets carried the story by mid-March 2021, and US media soon followed. Family members gave interviews describing SARM as someone who would not simply walk away. The global attention pressured local agencies, but it also created friction. Questions about why some searches were halted and why the investigation did not proceed with greater urgency on the yacht itself. Ryan Bain, the last known person with SARM, became central to the narrative. Public records revealed a prior domestic violence conviction in Michigan, a detail widely reported by outlets and confirmed in court archives. While prior history is not evidence of current crime, investigators always weigh patterns. Advocates for Sarm's family pushed authorities to view her disappearance not as an isolated incident, but in light of documented behavior. Still, there was no direct proof tying him to her fate. Preliminary statements, media interviews, and procedural documents show that Bain cooperated minimally, declined to sit for detailed questioning, and retained counsel early. To law enforcement, his stance complicated the search. To the public, it fueled suspicion. In victimology analysis, when the partner is the last contact and provides limited transparency, the risk profile escalates further. Family pressure became its own force. Heslop's parents and close friends campaigned actively in the UK, calling for diplomatic engagement. They emphasized that without Sarm's body, they could not even claim certainty of death. To them, that state of limbo was intolerable. They pushed for FBI involvement and broader interagency cooperation. By 2022, international organizations like Interpol were aware of the case, but jurisdiction remained primarily with Virgin Islands police. From an investigative standpoint, escalation is marked by each door that closes. No digital footprints after March 7th, no financial traces, no physical recovery, no comprehensive interview with the last person to see her alive. By the spring of 2022, nearly every avenue that could yield resolution had narrowed. Escalation also meant the case shifted categories, from an urgent search to an enduring mystery, one that required strategic review rather than tactical recovery. For the local community, the impact was immediate. Residents of St. John, who were accustomed to the island being perceived as a safe haven, now saw international headlines framing it as the site of an unsolved crime. Tourism boards faced questions from travelers. Expatriate workers expressed unease. And for those who had spent time with Sarm in Cruz Bay, the absence was a daily reminder of how quickly someone could vanish. As her case escalated into a global narrative, it highlighted systemic challenges. Limited resources on small islands, jurisdictional gaps between U.S. territories and mainland agencies, and the difficulty of building a criminal case without physical evidence. These realities are not unique to the Virgin Islands. They illustrate how, in missing persons investigations worldwide, escalation can mean not more answers, but fewer. By mid-2023, advocacy groups in both Britain and the Virgin Islands had begun treating her case as a benchmark example of why early evidence preservation matters. They argued that immediate access to the yacht and unrestricted forensic examination could have altered the trajectory. The absence of those steps left unanswered questions that now define the case. And so the escalation phase reached a plateau. Without new evidence, the file could not advance to formal charges. Yet without resolution, it remained active, waiting for either a breakthrough tip or the rare chance discovery that sometimes reopens long-dormant mysteries. Sarm Heslop's victimology paints the picture of a woman unlikely to walk away. The escalation timeline shows a case where the lack of evidence became evidence itself. The unanswered question remains, how does a healthy adult vanish from a confined yacht without leaving a single recoverable trace? The longer an investigation remains without resolution, the more pressure builds, not just on the local detectives, but on every agency whose name becomes tied to the file. By 2023, 2 years after Sarm Heslop's disappearance from Ryan Bain's yacht off St. John, the case had entered that tense limbo. The Virgin Islands Police Department, VIPD, still listed her as missing, the Coast Guard held its search logs, and federal authorities were quietly monitoring developments. But no charges had ever been filed. In cases like this, the question becomes procedural. Does the file remain an open missing person report, or does it begin to edge toward a criminal referral? The threshold is higher than most viewers realize. U.S. prosecutors need a coherent chain of evidence, physical, digital, testimonial, that can survive not just investigation, but the scrutiny of a federal courtroom. Without a body, and without direct evidence of foul play, theories are all that remain. And theories alone cannot support an indictment. Investigators began to draft internal memoranda. Some emphasized negative evidence, no forced entry, no water taxi records, no surveillance captures of Sarm leaving the boat. Others pointed to behavioral anomalies, Ryan's reported refusal to allow a cabin search by local police within the crucial early hours. Each report was labeled working, not confirmed. It was a careful, bureaucratic language, the language of a case that no one wanted to close, but no one could push forward either. Forensic consultation files show how federal agents evaluated the probabilities. In missing adult at sea cases, most incidents are categorized as accidental, falls, misadventure, or voluntary disappearance. Yet Sarm's case carried details that resisted easy classification. She was a strong swimmer, familiar with Caribbean waters, and those who knew her stated firmly that she would never leave without contacting family. In legal analysis, those statements are hearsay with probative weight, not evidence but context. Later that year, as the British press continued coverage, pressure shifted again. Her family petitioned UK's authorities to request renewed cooperation under bilateral agreements. Technically, the case fell under US jurisdiction, but international comedy required responses. For local detectives, this meant file reviews, interviews relogged, and every missing piece highlighted again. And yet the entries read the same: no witness statements beyond the boyfriend, no body recovered, cause of death undetermined. The frustration was palpable. Cold case experts know that the absence of evidence becomes its own problem. Without forensic anchors, no phone activity, no GPS trail, no recovered clothing, every theory seems equally possible and equally unprovable. One internal note summarized the dilemma. The data aligns too cleanly with a voluntary disappearance scenario. That may itself be the problem. The community on St. John had its own view. Residents spoke of the disruption to the island's reputation. Tourism thrives on perceptions of safety. A missing tourist, especially one tied to headlines across the Atlantic, struck at the heart of local trust. For investigators, community sentiment adds urgency but not proof. They could not charge a crime based on unease. They needed something more. By 2024, VIPD quietly moved the case to a cold case review unit. That label does not mean abandoned. It means resource shifted, kept open, but no longer staffed with daily activity. Such reviews typically occur once or twice a year, when detectives revisit whether new evidence has surfaced or whether new technology might assist. In this case, neither had materialized. The legal theory remained suspended. Some prosecutors outlined a possible obstruction charge, hinging on whether Ryan's refusal of a search had hindered the investigation. But obstruction requires proof of willful intent, and in U.S. law, refusal alone, without a warrant, falls within constitutional rights. Others floated the possibility of a negligent overboard theory, but negligence is a civil standard, not a criminal one, and it would not lead to homicide charges. At family vigils, the language shifted. Relatives spoke less of immediate answers, more of the long haul. They understood what cold case status meant: years of waiting, punctuated by occasional calls from detectives, but no breakthrough. For viewers unfamiliar with this process, it raises a hard truth. Most cold cases never reach court unless new evidence emerges by chance or confession. For investigators, that means living with uncertainty. The notes they draft today may be the same files a prosecutor reads a decade from now. The accuracy of those notes, the clarity of their forensic language becomes essential. A single inconsistency about timeline, about negative evidence, can fracture a future case. That is why every procedural detail is logged and why no one closes the file, even when options appear exhausted. For Sarm Heslop's family, the lack of closure remains its own burden. In interviews, they emphasize not blame, but the need for transparency. They ask why authorities did not seize phones earlier, why the yacht was never forensically processed in full, why interagency communication lagged. Each unanswered question becomes a wound. For investigators, those same gaps represent lessons, opportunities missed, but also markers of what must be done differently in future cases. As of August 27, 2025, the file remains open, categorized as a missing person case with cause of death undetermined. No indictment has been issued. No charges have been filed. The yacht has long since sailed away, and the waters off St. John carry no trace. For those who follow crime cases, the story underscores a sobering reality. Not all mysteries reach resolution, even when the names are known, even when the spotlight burns bright. And for those watching, the question lingers. What standard of proof should society demand before labeling a disappearance as crime? By 2025, the absence of formal charges in Sarm Heslop's disappearance had become its own defining feature. A case once expected to draw swift legal action remained suspended, neither closed nor advanced. For investigators, this void was not unusual. In maritime disappearances without recovered remains, prosecutors almost never reach a trial. For families, however, the lack of courtroom proceedings represents a second loss, justice deferred indefinitely. Internal reviews highlight the threshold problem. To bring a case before a jury, prosecutors need more than suspicion. They need admissible evidence, forensic material, witness testimony, or digital traces that can be cross-examined. In Sarm's file, those anchors were missing. The yacht had not been fully searched in the immediate aftermath. No forensic sweep secured hard evidence, and no external witnesses observed her leaving. Without those pillars, prosecutors faced a gap too wide to bridge. Legal analysts pointed out parallels to other cases. In the U.S., successful homicide prosecutions without a body, the so-called no-body murder cases, have occurred, but only when backed by overwhelming circumstantial evidence. Large financial anomalies, incriminating digital communications, or confessions. In this case, none of those components existed. The digital record showed silence. The financial background revealed no sudden shifts, and the sole witness remained silent. That left the Virgin Islands Police Department and federal observers caught in procedural stasis. A cold case designation meant periodic file reviews, but not daily activity. Prosecutors could not draft an indictment because there was nothing to indict on. Defense attorneys would dismantle any theory within minutes by asking the simplest of questions. Where is the victim, and how do you know what happened? For families, these legal nuances bring little comfort. Sarm's relatives pressed repeatedly for hearings, petitions, and renewed media attention. They emphasized the principle that a young woman vanished in U.S. on territorial waters under circumstances that deserved full accountability. They knew the obstacles, but they also knew the value of persistence. Public pressure can sometimes reopen doors that procedure closes. In interagency communications, UK authorities monitored the file, but jurisdiction remained US-based. International cooperation had limits. Without new evidence, requests for prosecution review led to polite but firm replies, insufficient basis for charges. This became the recurring phrase, the formal stamp on letters that otherwise carried no progress. For those studying crime cases, the absence of trial proceedings underscores a systemic truth. Justice often depends less on what likely happened and more on what can be proven. Even in high-profile disappearances, the courtroom remains closed unless facts can be demonstrated under oath. The standard is high by design to prevent wrongful conviction. But for families left behind, that safeguard can feel like abandonment. Community members on St. John voiced frustration of their own. A lingering perception grew that justice was uneven, swift for some crimes, slow or absent for others. That tension eroded trust. Detectives tasked with cold case reviews knew they carried not only the burden of evidence, but the perception of fairness. In law enforcement, perception matters. A case unresolved can weaken public faith as much as a case mishandled. By mid-2025, 4 years after the night Sarm vanished, legal experts described the file as stuck in permanent intake. Unless new forensic evidence emerged, through chance discovery, whistleblower, or confession, the likelihood of trial remained negligible. That does not mean the case was closed. It means the justice system was waiting, as much in limbo as the family itself. By March 2025, 4 years after Sarm Heslop vanished from a catamaran anchored off St. John in the U.S. and Virgin Islands, the case remains unresolved. No body has been recovered. No charges have been filed. Her name still sits in databases as an open missing person file. What began as a sudden disappearance in the Caribbean has become a long-running test of how modern justice systems deal with maritime crime, cross-border victims, and the limits of available evidence. The official record shows a case frozen in status but alive in public memory. The Virgin Islands Police Department continues to list the file as open under investigation. Interpol notices remain active, and the British Foreign Office maintains contact with U.S. authorities. Each agency points to jurisdictional challenges: a missing woman of British nationality, a vessel registered under U.S. law, an incident occurring in coastal waters where international maritime rules also apply. The result is a legal maze with no court resolution. For Sarm's family in the United Kingdom, the years have meant repeated appeals. They have flown to the Virgin Islands, lobbied Parliament in London, and organized awareness campaigns across Europe. Their message is consistent. Without transparency and without access to investigative files, the truth risks being buried. These efforts highlight not only one family's grief but also a structural weakness. When a person disappears at sea, procedural certainty can evaporate. In community forums and investigative reports, attention has focused on procedural decisions made during the critical first 48 hours. The lack of a comprehensive forensic sweep of the vessel, the absence of seized digital devices, and delays in obtaining cell site and GPS records remain sticking points. Independent crime analysts note that such gaps create permanent obstacles for prosecutors because evidence that might have clarified whether foul play occurred was never secured in time. These are not speculative complaints. They are documented absences in the investigative timeline. Meanwhile, Ryan Bain, the last confirmed person to see Sarm alive, has not been charged with any crime. He retains his status as a private citizen. His attorneys emphasize his cooperation with certain requests while declining others on grounds of constitutional rights. In U.S. squash law, silence or refusal is not an admission of guilt, but it fuels suspicion in the court of public opinion. This tension between lawful rights and public perception illustrates the thin line investigators must walk. Internationally, Sarm's disappearance has been covered by British tabloids, American networks, and Caribbean local outlets. Each anniversary brings new headlines, but no new answers. For the public, the case has become a symbol of frustration. How can someone vanish in a contained setting, a boat anchored close to shore, without leaving conclusive evidence? For investigators, it is a reminder that not every crime scene is recoverable, and not every missing person case results in a body or a trial. Yet even in this void, meaning can be drawn. Families of missing persons often become advocates, pushing for better coordination across jurisdictions. In Sarm's case, her parents and friends have emphasized the need for mandatory forensic protocols in maritime disappearances, stricter requirements for immediate device seizures, and stronger cross-border legal frameworks. These proposals, if acted on, could improve responses for future victims. The human impact should not be lost. Behind the procedural language, logs, timelines, evidence gaps, was a woman who lived, traveled, and dreamed. Her disappearance is not just a police file, it is a reminder of vulnerability. At sea, the boundaries of safety and danger blur quickly. For viewers following this case, it poses a sobering question. If it were your loved one, how much transparency and accountability would you demand? As of August 27, 2025, no resolution has been reached. The case stands where it did years ago, classified as a missing person investigation with no cause of death established, no criminal indictment filed, and no closure for those left behind. Cause of death, undetermined. Case remains under investigation as a missing person crime. This is where the official record ends, but the story does not vanish. It endures in public awareness, in family persistence, and in the broader call for systemic change. In true crime storytelling, there are cases that conclude with a verdict and others that remain open wounds. Sarm Heslop's disappearance belongs to the latter, reminding us that justice delayed is also justice denied, and that accountability in crime must extend beyond borders and beyond silence. As I close this story, I can't help but reflect on how fragile life can be and how quickly certainty can vanish. Sarm's case reminds us that answers are not always guaranteed, but persistence, truth, and accountability still matter. For me, the lesson is clear. Never ignore the small signs, and never assume silence means safety. What do you think this case teaches us about trust, justice, and responsibility? I'd love to hear your perspective. Share where you're watching from and tell me your thoughts below. And if this story moved you, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next crime case we uncover together.